There's a caveat I have to make before I begin. So, of course, I want to thank IIT and Typo Day for having me here. It's a great honor, and I feel a little bit guilty about it because I'd like to make a caveat, and that is I'm not a typographer. I am not a typographer. I actually looked it up in the dictionary for the first time, and this is on a Merriam-Webster online dictionary, and here's what it says. And you can have a read. I really don't think that fits what I've ever done or that fits me very well. But since I'm here, incidentally, the Merriam-Webster also offers words that rhyme with typography. Can anyone think of a reason why they might want to do that? I did look it up. Pornography is one of them. I just thought it might be nice to know. So I started out with just what I'd call a love of letters, and I started out trying to be a real typographer. One of the members in the audience today, Aurobind Patel, who you know well, is one of the people who set me out on this journey and sort of taught me the fundamentals of what I know. And I started out trying to be a real typographer, a type designer who, as you all know, is a somewhat superior kind of typographer. Really? Does anyone agree with that? Okay. Over time, though, I really didn't find a way to be good enough or committed enough to make a living at it. And so I really became a graphic designer, which is a user of type and typography. So using type and typography to do graphic design, and I tried to be as good at, as well versed with typographic practice as possible. I've become consciously good at using it, but it didn't become a specialization. More recently, we would define ourselves as a problem-solving kind of company. We became a company. And even more than that, we now like to describe ourselves as a problem-finding company, because I find that problem-finding is perhaps more important than problem-solving. In other words, asking the question, what is the most impactful problem that we can solve for you? What's the best thing that we can do for you? And working that out, it goes under different names. Some people call it strategy, and some people call it planning, and that's a subject for later. So this is the kind of hierarchy of needs, if you like, that has brought me here, but with the caveat that I just mentioned. So what I'd like you to do today, and I'm addressing myself not to a great many mentors of mine who I see in the audience. There's Mahendra Bhai, there's Aurobind, there's Vikas Satwalekar, Suranjana. They're here for comfort, okay? They're my support group, but I'm really addressing myself to all of you in the back rows there, the ones with more black on top than I have. So I'd just like to take you through my journey and talk about my relationship with typography, and more from the position of a lover, of somebody who loves it, rather than the position of an expert. And the central message of what I have to say is just this, that developing a deep interest, and I mean not just learning how to set type, but developing a deep interest, going into some depth into letter form, will make your work and your life richer. Just that, richer. Taking an interest is a start. Developing it into an obsession is best. My goal is to try and infect you with the virus that I was infected with, and pass it on to you. And if somehow I can give you even a slight fever, then I would be quite pleased about this. So it's, like I said, not as an expert, to go from an interest to make it an infection. And while this talk is it's about our past and our present, it's also a message from the future, because I'm 55, and that's, I think, about 30 years older than most of you in the audience. And to say, I mean, I'm making a bit of a bold statement when I say that my past is relevant to your future. I mean, why should it be? Why should whatever happened to me be what's going to happen to you? Well, it implies that I do believe typography will change in the next 30 years, but I think several themes are going to remain the same because human affairs and human beings are slow to change. And most of all, it will still be as important to your life as a designer as it is today. You know, more typefaces were made in the last 5 years than in the last 50 years before those 5 years. I made that up, but it's probably not far from the truth. I'm not sure what the numbers are. I did try and find out. But if you look at a curve, it sort of goes like that. There's an asymptotic, completely catastrophic rise in that curve. And the other thing is that it's a culture that's now 500 years old, something like now getting on to 550 years old, of the practice of setting type in some kind of mechanized way. And such cultures just don't go away. I mean, just think about 100 years from now, would you be drinking red wine? Would we be loving cheese? Do you expect cheese to really radically change? How long have we been using cutlery? Do you know how old umbrellas are? It turns out that from the 11th century BC, not much change in the umbrella. Little mechanization, that's about it. So I think the written word is going to remain, and from there let's begin. My fascination with type emerges from my interest in ways of writing, the kind of fascination that every 6-year-old has when you learn to operate a fountain pen and you start getting into ways of writing. My father was a sculptor. He was a sculptor in a very abstract kind of contemporary way, and my mother is an artist. She's a potter. Some of you call it ceramics artist or something like that. We like the word potter. And she specializes in working on the surface of the pots. And there's a technique known as sgraffito, which means scratching. And that's the word from which the word graffiti is actually derived. And here's a pot that's typical of one of her styles. And she claims that I influenced her to do these pots. She's made that claim a couple of times. I don't recall this, but I guess that's the nature of influence. Now it's covered with the letters of an imaginary script, and she calls it Iramis. Her name is Ira, and she has done several explorations around this. So the love of letters is quite universal, and it's the love of letters for what they are, and it's not about necessarily for what they say. Some 10 years after this pot, our office created a poster for a film festival on ethnography. And ethnography is a word that's entered design practice now, but really it's the observation of cultural practices by analyzing or observing objects, languages, and artifacts of that culture. And here's what that poster looked like. And as you can see, there's an imaginary script that and accompanied by a set of objects turned into the sort of chart that children take to school, the ones that say T for train or R for, rat or whatever. That's a way in which, just by being open to invention, I think your work can be enriched to quite a degree. That is the poster, by the way. That isn't an image of somebody holding up the poster. So just to clarify. So rewinding back a couple of years, when I went to school, one of our teachers visited England on an exchange program. And at that time, England was trying to revive the italic hand, and he learned the italic hand, and he came back and he began producing this amazing hand on a blackboard. And I was absolutely fascinated, and I started learning the italic hand, which very much stays with me today. And that's roughly what my hand looks like if I'm writing patiently. We had to work from copy books, and then in later years, I came to realize that those copy books weren't the best examples of the hand. They were far too round for what an italic should be. And I discovered in the library then that, 15th century masters who were actually the founders or the icons of this hand, and I learned that. But that didn't really matter. Today, we are likely to use the italic hand specifically, and the broad-edged tool more generally, as I use it, is the most effective way, the quickest way which I have experienced to teach the fundamentals of letter form. Talk about spacing, you talk about the structure of letters, you talk about the rationale of letters. Somewhat controversially, I've also insisted that this applies even in sans serif letter forms. It applies over a range of styles actually, because the fundamentals of how you piece things together don't change very much. So as a means of spacing, this is not my work. This is work from people who've passed through our studio, and there's always 2 or 3 people. So it's an informal training. It's not compulsory, but in every batch of 5 or 6 people, there are 1 or 2 guys who get quite charged up about it, and they do that. Over the years, I've maybe taught a dozen people to become pretty decent calligraphers, and I've even taught handwriting to some people who are not designers, who just wanted to learn the italic hand, and that's a kind of open offer. I do that. So just exploring the structure of letters. Now what I want to emphasize here is I'm not teaching or talking about excellence in calligraphy. I'm just not talking about that. Though some people have gone on to become very good at it, I'm quite reasonable and much better than some of the people I've taught. That's the way they wanted to develop. My point is more about writing to understand things, or doing calligraphy to see rather than to show. And the broad edge tool is the fastest way to do that, to understand these structures. And the experience of writing letters is particularly good because if you have a little bit of skill, not a lot of skill, then the task of observing letters and studying them and absorbing what's special about them becomes very, very fast. And your rate at which you're able to absorb lettering concepts goes up a great deal faster. Just as an analogy, I'm obsessed by Hindustani classical music. I am, and that's another obsession of mine. Now, I try to sing, and I try to teach myself to sing better. I'm not here to sing for others, but because I also make an effort to understand the grammar of rags, and I've gone into quite a lot of depth with that. I will never become a scholar, I'll never be a performer, I'm not interested in writing. If there is an organization like Raga Day, I will not be at it. Maybe I'll be in the audience, but it makes my listening much richer. So for me, to sing is to listen is to sing. That's the approach that I'd like to sell you if I can. You can do this on a computer. Lots of computer software simulates a broad-edged tool very well. Those of you who are observant, you'll see that in the work that I'm going to show. You could use Adobe Illustrator, and you could learn how to place weight in the right places. You can explore form. You can understand what happens when you change things. Hand and the computer aren't enemies. There's Professor R.K. Joshi is a good example of that. There are others I can name. The good thing, many lettering artists straddle both the worlds quite happily. And the thing is about calligraphy is that you don't forget what you learn with the body. So muscle memory has a way of going into your brain. It's a bit like bicycling. You can't forget what you learn with your body very easily. So that's what I'd really recommend. So at some point in my 20s, I met Aurobind, who's looking very thoughtful somewhere on the 7th row. And Aurobind Patel has been a speaker. He still is a mentor. He encouraged me, gave me the confidence to believe that I could switch professions, and I was then inspired to try designing type. That lasted for a while. As it turned out in 1991, I was approached by the Rashtrapati Bhavan. So I was still I at that point. I was approached at the Rashtrapati Bhavan to create a 14-foot high hanging with the text of the preamble of the Constitution. You know, the one that's been in the news lately. We the people of India and so on. It was to be in English and Hindi, and I decided that a calligraphic Roman hand would work, partly because there was no one to contradict me, and because I thought it suited the style of the building, you know, colonial and so on. And my own calligraphic Roman hand and my own Devanagari, which I thought matched the Roman quite well. The only way to get them onto the cloth, of course, was to screen print them in pieces. You use several screens and then you build up this thing that would be 14 feet high. There really weren't then, you know, the facilities to print letters at large sizes, and enlarging them photographically would mean a loss of quality. I could write a few letters at a large size and try and convert them into film, but the challenge of maintaining consistency was really beyond me. So I did the next best thing, which is that I wrote out the alphabet with the largest pen I had. Of course, I was very, very stingy with my time. The preamble doesn't have a Z, and so my first set of letters didn't have a Z, okay? The largest pen I had, and I just put these up on a soft board, you know, so technologies like scanning or things like that weren't that prevalent at the time, not in India. And I just eyeballed them just by looking at them. I drew the letters using vector curves on a Mac with a 9-inch screen, and then I mocked it up as a typeface. I just basically got it into a you know, Fontographer. That was the popular program at the time, and printed out the words on A4 sheets using a 300 dpi laser printer. And then, you know, even the word secular wouldn't fit on an A4. It turns out secular doesn't fit on anything. But we were all used to pasting letters by hand, and that was a great way to learn to space letters, precisely because it's slow and it slows the brain down, which is why I am the way I am. I pasted up the entire thing so that it could be photographed with high contrast film, and then it was screen printed. So the point here is that this was not an effort to create a polished typeface. In fact, just the reverse. If you have a look at these letters, what I'm trying to preserve is some of the ways in which serifs get formed by the way in which brush strokes end. And I've tried to keep many of the imperfections in my own writing alive, just as a sort of vanity on my part. I say vanity because I've also removed some of the imperfections in my ways of writing to make it more palatable for people to see. But this is not, I don't call this really a typeface, though it is, in some sense of the word. Just take a dance around it. You'll see all the oddities of calligraphic writing preserved, and you will see that parts of typefaces that should be similar aren't really similar, and they are one time one way and one time the other way. And something like the A, which this is how I would naturally draw it. I mean, the left edge, the left stroke of the A, the thin stroke, I would be able to complete in a single stroke just by rotating the pen, so not holding it at the same angle. I was with a demonstration with R.K. Joshi once, and he said, "Hey, no cheating." And because I leave it that way and didn't finish it, I decided to preserve it. You know, you'll more commonly find in letters which have got a serif on one side that happens on the thicker stroke than on this one, but I just let them be. Or if you look at the D, which is joint at the top in a way that can only happen if you're using a pen. If you look at the junction on the top, the same thing with the E. Getting the bottom half, the bottom stroke horizontal to do it in a single stroke requires rotating the pen twice. It's a trick I I could perform it if you could get a camera here, but not so well now. But maybe on 10 or 20 tries, I'll get it right. If you look at the H, I think none of the serifs are alike, and I've just kept them that way. Or look at the N, in which there is a curvature in the diagonal stroke. That curvature is kind of almost, I found it impossible to erase from when I was writing them out, impossible to get it absolutely straight. And it sort of even makes sense to me. And I'll come back to that making sense bit in a while. There's the O, which is symmetrical, but not terribly symmetrical. And well, here's what the finished result really looks like. I'm afraid I've lost the Devanagari over time, and it's a shame. I never thought of this as a production typeface. This process took about a week. It's just a technique I use to complete a project. It's a very pragmatic approach, and I want to stress that you don't have to romanticize the business of doing type design. I mean, type design is not, it's a wonderful activity, but it's not a greater activity than, rearing bees or anything else. By this time, I'd already given up the notion of becoming a type designer, a proper type designer, but the bug doesn't quite go away. And in 1991 again, I was asked to design a book on Jaipur. This was going to be a big coffee table book. It was on Rajasthan, though it was called Jaipur, and has a very large visual and historical spread. The way the book is written, it's a coffee table book with a lot of history. And the book is inevitably about its kings and its rulers and, the art and the architecture that they patronized. And I was quite fascinated by its flavor, which was at the same time quite classical and quite rugged. Lots of our classical arts are rooted in North India, they're rooted in Rajasthan. And so I chose a typeface which was also quite elegant and rugged. Some of you will recognize this as Trump Medieval by the German George Trump, who incidentally was a colleague of Paul Renner. I don't know if the name is familiar. It's a modern Roman with a lot of humanist details. I'm not going to go into what those are. I'm presuming that the word humanist is understood by you, but if not, here's an example. So I began looking at some of these letters and I was admiring them, blowing them up on my 9-inch Macintosh. A product called Adobe Type Manager had just arrived, which let you see sharp outlines. And it was amazing to blow up these letters. And then I began looking at the ways the C's and the E's end, which is, by the way, how it is in quite a lot of George Trump's typefaces. And I began to see the tales of Jaipur's Maharajas. I mean, they were there in my head, and I saw these very sharp and wicked terminals, and I said, if you wanted to hurt somebody with that C, you could, you could kind of push it into them and a little twist of the wrist, and you'd get quite a lot of their flesh out, And I thought of all these palace murders, and I thought of intrigue and betrayal. And then I saw just the word Jaipur written out, and I looked at that J, and I said, okay, there I have it. This is it. This is death. And this is how I responded. So I responded again with a piece of hand lettering, which this is a kind of opening spread from that. And it tells you quite clearly what I think about what I was thinking, what I think about what I was thinking. How amazing is that? And finally, this is the final form on the cover. That J never quite went away. You'll spot it later. In about 1999, I was received a request to do calligraphy for a wedding card. So a lot of people had not only mistaken me for a typographer, some people mistook me for a calligrapher. The only person I know I've met who was extremely good at both of these things, type design and calligraphy. It's a colleague of Aurobin's who told me that if I kept working for another 10 years, I would make a pretty fair scribbler. I wasn't really a calligrapher in the sense that I could reliably turn out quickly in a professional way lots of calligraphy, and so I'd been fascinated with some capitals that I'd seen. What helped was that the wedding itself wasn't a traditional Indian wedding. It was to be in a sort of Western style, not entirely an Indian wedding, and I thought that's a chance. So I drew out a few letters with a ball pen in the manner that I would. So they were, in that sense, not quite written out by pen. And then I spent a happy day converting it into a typeface very quickly. And I stress the very quickly part because not having the time to perfect it means that also some of the original ideas that are there in it, they tend to get preserved. And as a typeface in the usual sense, it has more problems than there are letters, you know. It has more problems than I can count. But I think the forms are quite valid, and the structure is interesting in that you'll notice that letters are either slightly exaggeratedly wide or they are very determinedly narrow, and that's a contrast that I found quite pleasing. Just walk you around it a little bit. So you'll see here the wide and narrow letters. You'll see the very similar themes. Look at the D, quite similar themes. The N, which by now I had developed into something which had what in architecture we would call squinches. If you've seen a Romanesque cathedral, then you see lots of arches applied in a row, and the junctions between them are squinches, and those are what I'd call a squinch today. But it's a form of the N that I've sort of come back to over here. I've used this type on quite a few things like cards for friends, but I've also used it to bring out the handmade nature of things, which it does quite effortlessly without doing it in a very obvious way. Here's a poster and a CD for a film which is about a community in Manipur that in Arunachal that uses cane to build very long bridges as a community project. In the forest hangs a bridge, and here it is. I sort of can hear John D. Williams's music or David Lean production, but it's really a documentary, quite a beautiful documentary. Here's what that looks like. So that's the type in use. I have used it. It's not that I haven't used it as a typeface, but it's like any bootleg product. You can fall sick using it. So you have to know what you're doing. Okay. So next time we live in a prohibition city. Are we now no longer a prohibition city? Have we stopped? Okay. We were once. Sometime later, Indigo Restaurant approached us, and the restaurant was inspired from Nouvelle Cuisine, which is a style of cooking in which you don't get to eat very much. I'm just joking. But there's a style, there's a great emphasis on ingredients which are very minimally treated, and it's about how close does the food look to when it was farmed or when it was killed, and as the case may be. And so the logo evolves from the image of a leaf and a grain that's on the left. There's a leaf, and then there's the fish, which is of course fresh catch from Colaba, right around the corner. And the lettering was something of a problem until my partner said to me, "That bloody wedding card lettering, that's what we need." And so that's what we used here. Indigo used this typeface. I actually loaned it to them to use on menus. You know, understandably, the patience with it didn't last long because it needs somewhat careful handling. So I continued to do quite a lot of cards, and here I want to tell you something about events and working for cultural organizations and working for friends. So these are a very good intrusion into your professional life, and because you'll notice that if you look at lots of the very seminal pieces of graphic design, lots of them have been done for cultural organizations. Lots of them have been done for paper companies. Lots of them have been done. Why is that? Because for the same reasons, you get a chance to relax your standards of what constitutes an effective piece, about the market impact, about strategic factors, and be a little experimental and let your hair down. And I'm going to talk a little about being on the somewhat extreme edge of taking liberties with the form of things. In taking liberties, the essential structure of letters is quite essential. So I don't know if many of you have read Eric Gill's essay on typography. If you haven't, it can be found online. In fact, it's going to be in reprint this summer sometime. It suggests that you read that. But with sufficient familiarity, you can have the confidence to break some rules and have some fun, precisely because the familiarity of the words that you're going to set is very high, and the need for convention is countervailingly low. So you can have that fun. Here's a card for my mother, Ira Chaudhary, again. It's based on my admiration for her unique decorative style, and where she covers the surface of the pot. And the themes that are so eclectic that the origin can just never be found. And it says Ira turns 80, for those of you who might need help. That was on her 80th birthday in an exhibition that she did. For those of you interested, you'll have to probably come onto the computer and see it in some detail. I'm afraid it's not reproducing well in this low contrast setting. So as someone said, originality depends on the obscurity of your sources. So it allows both Ira Chaudhary and me to be original. Here's another card. This one is for a friend. Once again, this is hand lettered directly on a computer, hand lettered directly on freehand. I don't know if you remember, Illustrator-like product called Freehand, since acquired by Adobe and retired, put out to stud, as it were. And it also uses a kind of lettering that I would do by hand anyway, and I assembled them, and then the letters were assembled on a computer using a very simple typeface program. And it's kind of semi-manual and semi-machine done job, which at some point will move on. Oh, there it does. And that's what the card looks like. So you can have a lot of fun with cards for friends. It's another card in the series. I want to talk about a different sort of liberty taken with what is the correct way of lettering, or even the correct way of writing things. So here I want to make a personal sort of reference. I first met R.K. Joshi in about 1985. I think that I just learned that's about a year after this ITC was set up. And this was also quite a key event in my life. I counted him as a teacher. Of course, as a student, I was in the Eklavya mode, so I was at a distance. I didn't receive formal instruction from him. We did some calligraphy demonstrations together, and his influence and his voice are still very much in my head. One of the things that he sensitized me to, and this he did actually before we met, R.K. Joshi had done a calendar and a diary for a stationery company called Vakils, and I had that diary. It was based on Indian scripts, and I kept it for 10 or 15 years. It was so utterly beautiful, and there was so much to learn from. And one of the things he sensitized me to is how Indian scripts are related in their forms. We have lots of scripts, 9 or 10 of them, and they're related in their forms. So in about 2013, that's about 30 years later, a festival called the Kabir Festival occurred. And the Kabir Festival they named it Leher Leher Kabir because it was done on the banks of the Ganga in Haridwar. And it presented an opportunity to remember this lesson. So it's a very modern celebration of an ancient poet, you know. So it's devoted to music, dance, art, scholarship, translation, all this stuff around Kabir. So in a very modern way, it celebrates what is traditional. Now, I began thinking about this, and somewhere the voice of R.K. Joshi, you know, must have come into me through my dreams, because if you look at the letter K, here is a very elementary, just a simple K that I've written out in Devanagari, and if you look at it in Bangla, and if you look at it in Gujarati, they appear to have a common ancestry. There's a certain common morphology between them. In fact, topologically, they are almost identical. Just to demonstrate that, if you have a look at this. Yeah, shall I play that again? It's not unreasonable to say yes, and similarly, if you look at the K with a few liberties, you'll have to make it fall down first, and then once you do that, it's not again that unreasonable to say that it becomes this. So I thought this was a very interesting connection because it isn't really clear, just like how these languages have now crystallized into distinct scripts, and when they were once had common ancestors, it really isn't clear in a parallel way who Kabir really was. I mean, there's a postage stamp of him. That's pretty amusing. We have no visual way of knowing what Kabir looked like. It's an assumption. It's not clear who he was ethnically. It's not clear what language his poems were really in. It's not clear that he wrote all of them in the way that we see authorship today. It's clear that two of his disciples appear to have recorded much of what he wrote, but it's changed in the process of oral transmission. So Kabir is kind of open source, you know, he's a bit like open source poetry. It's not clear what the language was. It's a kind of Hindi, but that Hindi isn't spoken today. So I took advantage of this to invent some traditional characters. Now, how can you invent traditional characters? That's what I tried to do. So it's a very modern take on old scripts for a very modern celebration of an old poet. And it went something like this. Here's something which draws from a kind of exploration with the Bengali side of the script. And here's something which draws from an exploration from, if you like, the Gujarati side of the script. And that I took that a little bit further. Even too far sometimes. And experimented with it on a simple layout. So there's the experiments of various schools of it. Some are softer, harder, wavier. So I was also trying to look for the leher in the Kabir. But essentially it's a hybrid script, and you wouldn't recognize this just in the same way as we're not quite sure how Kabir wrote what he wrote. Because he didn't write, he just said them. I'm a big fan of a lot of his poetry and provided a lot of musical material for singers in our time. Maybe some repetition here. So there you go. The point is, if you are willing to go a little bit far from where you started out, and the advantage is not that necessarily the achievement of expertise. It is not even necessarily the achievement of proficiency, leave alone expertise, but it is the possibility of being open to lots more influences and at least having some fun on the way, at least. Over the years, ICD that's my firm, learned to put typography at the center of a great many of its projects. Now, here I must mention that the work I'm now going to discuss is the work of my firm, and it's not strictly my work. Unfortunately, the format of design writing and speaking and some ways the culture about how we meet and talk about our work is very individual. You know, it's supposed to be Itu Chaudhry's work, and I'm afraid it's not. You know, I take great pride in the fact that in many of the projects I'm going to show you, my personal involvement ranges from great to moderate to slight to non-existent. In our role as a branding firm, we help discover a central idea for our clients, and sometimes the solution is rooted in typography. Here, attention does need to be paid to functionality along with distinction and, you know, the all-important factor of the brand's personality. I'm going to illustrate with a few examples, but I'm not really going to focus on the thought process behind the branding, just focus on the fun stuff, okay? There's a fashion brand in Delhi. There's a duo called Ashima Leena, very well known for traditional bridal couture, very heavy, very ornate, very using lots of Indian craft and fabric techniques. And they were launching their daughter's collection, one of their daughters, as a pret or a, ready-to-wear brand. And the character of this brand was that it was rooted in the same tradition, very decorative craft of India, but in a silhouette that was to be international and contemporary, a sort of fusion, addressing younger and somewhat more westernized audiences. And we had to brand it and name it. And the name we chose was Alias, because AL was Ashima Leena and the AL root was kept, and it was going to become a series of names which you can make from AL, which you can think of, alcohol for one. And it grows out from that root. So there's a process of growth of AL becoming Alias. And we started out playing around with versions of nobody? Okay. Versions of Bodoni, and because Bodoni tends to fuse cue fashion very easily, and from Bodoni we began looking at something that would be not quite Bodoni, but we looked at Walbaum, which is from the similar period. It's a little bit softer, and it was while looking at this kind of soft character, that observing this, that we hit upon the idea of a leaf. And a leaf is, and the way a leaf grows and becomes everything, is one of the most basic, kind of almost atomic element of the decorative fabric tradition in India, the Mughal tradition and everything that has succeeded it since then. And that results in the final shape. So it's, again, it's kind of modern, but it's rooted in a very traditional kind of concept. And that's what it looks like. There are many applications. There's interiors and there's all kinds of things which, and this leaf pattern grows in some quite interesting ways, but I'm not going into that because that's not typography proper. Or sometimes we've been playful, maybe even irresponsible. An FM station which we named 9 because its frequency was 91.9, so we thought 9 would be a nice name, 9 FM, and it's a very local, like all FM is very local. This is in North Bengal. Infa is a mining company. It's a mining company, just to cut a very long story. It's moving into power, into stainless steel. So it mines chromite, which is a raw material for making stainless steel, and they decided to get into stainless steel. They obviously consume a lot of power, so they decided to start selling some of that power, and they were ready for a new phase of their life, and we were rebranding them. So it was still very much in the ambit of heavy industry, and so we had hit upon some very heavy industry-like forms up on top there, and then we were also looking at saying that's not quite satisfactory because it was a little bit crude, and we said, why not get another parent, and we began looking at the standard for heavy typefaces, which is from the Futura family. And what we did is, I'm afraid I can't reproduce it here, but what we did is we used a process of interpolation, interpolating parts of letters to get slightly softer and harder variations. And by doing that, for, not just for letters, but including the primitives or the parts of letters, and by picking out different stages in the interpolation, we were able to kind of create a hybrid, which is the 1 second from top in a grade, which is what we finally used. So the ability or the freedom to do these things comes from acquiring certain familiarity and a certain, I would call it a kind of perception about lettering, and it's a perception that you can only build if you are willing to slow down and start making friends with some of these letters. Out of sequence, here is 91.9 FM. Found it. It allows you to leave pre-made type and kind of do your own thing. So we looked at 91.9 FM like this, and eventually we looked at it like this. And I don't know how many of you are going to spot what happens next, which is 91.9 becomes 9. So this always brings the house down, particularly after I make the gesture. Okay. So what I've been talking about till now is kind of very playful, very expressive uses of what you might call typographic familiarity. But you know, it's not, our work is not all play and no work. Typography does wake up and go to work and, you know, make a living and so on. So while I've been talking about the very playful side, that's not what our work is really like. An average day at ICD isn't like what's preceded before this. It's not exactly like what I'm about to show you next either, but maybe closer. So the fundamental role of type in several applications is very technical. It is about organization, it's about hierarchy, it's about all the things, all the vegetables that you have to eat when you're at design school. You know, it's not just about the fun that you can have. Publication design is one such, and things like newspapers. I've got some veterans sitting in the audience here. And the role of typography there comes much closer to the dictionary meaning that we saw. You really have to get a little bit more detailed with it than before. And this is about the Economic Times. They wanted to, okay, from a brand standpoint, refresh the design of the paper, which had become very uncontrolled and a bit chaotic. It's a bit like a bazaar with lots of color and people shouting, and not always shouting very politely. They were also worried that they were losing out on younger readers, and when we studied the problem for them and we talked to a few readers, we found that younger readers didn't want a younger looking newspaper. There's no need to do that. They're quite happy to read a mature looking paper that respected their reading habits. So it was a simpler agenda of a cleaned up design. Now, the key decision in such a thing is, of course, typography. So there's the Chronicle family, which we used for headlining. Headline typography really defines what the paper looks like to quite a large degree, and to fit its tone. So there's one side which is a very authoritative, very serious, easily cues financial newspapers. Lots of financial newspapers do something like this. And then on the other side of it, there's the Clan family, which is much more approachable, has a less formal voice, provides contrast, softens the personality. That's important for ET because actually ET pioneered the introduction of non-business content into business readers, with the aim of making it a reader for businessmen rather than just a business reader. Clan also allows emphasis and slugs at small sizes, and it performs quite well in a number of applications, which I shan't bore you with. But presenting this work wasn't very easy because we have high resolution laser printers and they render type accurately. And when they do that accurately, the prints really don't have the look of printed pages because newsprint tends to be printed even with the best presses, which is, the problem is much better than it used to be, but there's a lot of swelling. And this is a result of a very carefully calculated size. So this is actually on the old design, not our design. This uses the typeface that they had before we took it over. And setting it at this size, here is the idealized thing, close to what a laser printer would give you. And what you're looking around is a very high resolution scan of what the printed result looks like, and they don't quite match. So we discovered that by applying a stroke to the letters, we could get a result that was pretty close to the texture of type on our laser printer. So as always, our problem solving is very pragmatic and untidy, but it works for our situation and our context. It matched that query very well, and with a little bit of blurring, it could blend quite well into that type. We were able to approximate the effect from ET's presses, and this made presentation easier. So it's again a very small problem solved with a very small solution. However, the Economic Times, while being a business paper, doesn't fly business class. The Economic Times flies economy, and what the management, the CEO the MD is obsessed with is the ability to fit as many words as possible without sacrificing legibility. And that's of great importance to quite a few newspapers. So even if you are able to demonstrate that as we did, that here's our design, here's your original design, there's space left over because we are not using, since we're using good headline faces, we don't need headlines that large. You'd say, fine, but what about the number of words you're fitting in per square inch? So basically they're saying, can you win the race one-legged, tie up one leg and win the race. So this gave us the chance to do some very careful experimentation with sizes and leading and tracking and so on. And eventually the typefaces that work best in this area have three properties, which is fairly obvious. One is, of course, the thing about X height. What we learned through looking carefully is that X height has some strange properties. And one of them is that you can have two typefaces with the same X height, and one of them looks larger than the other. This is so, simply because there's a subtle exaggeration, and it's a kind of psycho-optical effect. So those typefaces look larger, they aren't really actually larger. And the key ratio that we found was that it's a ratio of the X height to ascenders and X height to capitals. That ratio seems to matter more than the absolute X height, and this is what we found by looking at a lot of typefaces. And here's a result of the study that we did on lots of typefaces that we had kind of shortlisted and from the body point of view. So you can see a lot of measures that we looked at, and finally we compared these to psychological measures. And what we learned is the truth that everybody knows, which is that Nimrod, a typeface called Nimrod, which is actually a known champion in this respect. So we reached the answer by careful analysis, but we must be humble that a little foreknowledge could have saved us about a week of work. But if you're a consultant, why jump to a conclusion when you can painfully labor your way to it? Here's what the printed results of looking at different kinds of tracking and so on for the client. And finally, here is our version of the finished result. If the paper doesn't look like this on most days, don't blame me. Now, which means I'm coming to the end of this, right? That's the time when the speaker says, now what do I see looking ahead? The means of producing type and typographic products, they've changed a lot. In the last 30 years, I've lived and worked through the times when we used letterpress for display type even, and we pasted it by hand, used a lot of darkroom techniques, a lot of high contrast film and photography, then moving to a brief period when photographic machines came to the fore, and type was being produced on a mechanized photographic system, and finally various forms of digital type. But ways of thinking about this type aren't showing much signs of change. And if you look at the huge explosion in the last few years, you'll find that there are not too many genuinely new explorations. A lot of them are derivations or even reproductions of old ideas, at very high quality sometimes. Some of the things we see that this class of typefaces seems to have evolved and is better explored than others, and hundreds of excellent typefaces come to your mailbox every month or every week if you just subscribe to some of them. This leads to a problem, and that problem is that choice has multiplied to a ridiculous degree, and what has now happened is that you have far more typefaces available to you than you can ever find or learn about or get to know. And one of the projects that I've been thinking about, only waiting for willing hands and some sponsorship, is anybody out there, is a project I call Fontabase. And the reason is that these are the only two typeface classification systems that we now really rely on, and they are based on style eras which are probably not very relevant to our time, and the way in which they categorize type is probably not the best thing for us. So our problem is search. Think about your music collection. If you're anything like me, you have far more music than you can listen to, even if you listen to music all day. The problem is, what do you want to listen to? How do you find it? How do you reach it? How do you even know what's there? So this is the problem that I think is going to be an opportunity, and that's something that needs solving. What are the kinds of categories that we'd have? What would be such a system? Now, the opportunities obviously in India, they lie with rising literacy. The next continent that's going to get rapidly developed is Africa. Unfortunately, the indigenous writing systems in Africa, it's very unclear what their future is, if there's any. Basically, they've been Romanized or turned into a form of Arabic that, an Africanized Arabic. Things are going to get more virtual than ever. I'm looking at, it's today already possible to, if you have a website, you have type that is served from you for type service. So type goes back to being a service. You don't have to own it, pretty much like the old days. You didn't own it, you bought it as a service. Maybe the same thing could happen for print, and there would be a sort of distributed printing environment, distributed workflow in which you would license a typeface for a print project and print in a highly encrypted manner, since you'll be online 25 hours a day anyway. The costs are going to go down, the choice is going to multiply, and that's the problem with expanding type. These ways don't really cut it for us anymore. So Fontabase should be an open, it should be a metric system, and it should also be a folksonomic system. So let me just explain that for half a minute. It would be a published methodology. It would be highly searchable. It should be a database of characteristics. The metric part, what I mean is, it's never really been measured. The metric part has never really been, when we say a typeface is bold, or we say the X height is large, we really don't have measures for these things. It would also have an expert side to it. In other words, what did experts say about this? And the folksonomic part means, it's like a wiki-like thing. What did lots of people say about it? Where was it used? This would make it a very rich system. So things like X height, things like fit, things like weight, contrast has never been measured. It's not a very difficult problem from a computing point of view to measure contrast. So previously unmeasured things can certainly be measured. Weight has never been measured. We use a very crude system of measuring weight. We say, what is its ratio of height to the width of the tallest strokes, and we call that weight. It's a rough measure, but when you actually set type on a page, what happens? Again, from a computing standpoint, that's really not hard to do. You get a much truer measure of the color of type, not like this. The contrast is, like I said, highly measurable too. And that brings me, I hope, to the end of this selection of slides. User opinion tags. So I think this self-organizing kind of nature of this project is what Fontabase, is what I'm calling it, should aim at. And that's a big opportunity to organize, make sense of the typographic abundance that we are seeing in the world. And I just wanted to end by saying that it's never been a better time to be in the typography business. Look at Typo Day. This itself is proof. There are dozens of conventions like Typo Day around the world. Today, at least in the West, if you say, I'm a typographer, nobody says, oh, what's that? It's possible to do a job in a typography company, I think even in India. This is wonderful news. Never been a better time to be in the business. On the other hand, not much has changed in typography. It's still quite dangerous as a business. Remember that the only reason that we know who Gutenberg really was because he went broke about 3 times in the course of his life. And each time he went broke, his creditors foreclosed, and those agreements are recorded in very well-kept records in the town in which, in Mainz, where Gutenberg lived and worked. And it's not very different today. Still, a lion's share of the revenue will be cornered by very few companies. I don't know how much that's changing, but the real reason to get involved with this is forget, you don't have to become a type designer. No harm if you do. Here's what's happening with the falling costs of type. This was Times New Roman, 1929. What it would cost you today to commission a project, something like this. Better way to think about is you could license it for 2 years for a web project for something like this. Better way to think about it. So get involved even if you're not in the business, because very few things will be this rewarding. And that's about the sum of what I really wanted to say. Thank you.